Great. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Joe Husbands. I'm the Learning Development Consultant at Cornerstone Resources, and I'll be leading us through today's session. We're also really pleased to be delivering this in partnership with Joe Santry from Christian Jobs, so you'll hear from him later in the session as well. Today's session is focused on recruiting well in a church context, being faithful, fair, and safe in the way that we recruit. So the aim is very simple. By the end, by the end of the next 30 minutes, we want you to feel more confident and clear in the decisions you're making when it comes to recruitment in your church. This isn't about turning churches into corporate organizations or overcomplicating things. It's about helping you take what you're already doing, often with really good intentions, and then adding some clarity, structure, and confidence around what you do. We'll keep it practical, grounded, and relevant to real situations that you'll face in a church context. But just a couple of practicalities today. Like I've said, the session will be recorded for you so you can watch it afterwards. If you could put yourself on mute just while we're speaking through the slides, that would be really appreciated. We will be asking for some interaction throughout, but that'll be through the chat box, but that'll be clear when I get to that. For today's session, there isn't a Q&A section, but if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll follow up after the session if we can do. Thank you very much. So let's move on to why this matters. Why are we doing this topic? Let's start with that. Recruiting in a church context is quite unique because every hiring decision carries both a spiritual responsibility and a legal accountability with it as well. So on one hand, you're making decisions that shape the culture, leadership, and direction of your church. On the other, churches are employers at the same time, which means those decisions also sit within a legal framework. So now in many churches, recruitment is often done informally. It's quite relational. It's based on trust, familiarity, and people you already know at times. And that can feel really positive and often is, but at the same time, informal approaches can create risk, limit transparency, and also narrow the pool of people you're considering, often without actually meaning to. So this session isn't about saying what you're doing wrong. It's about helping you make more informed, confident decisions when you're recruiting. And just to ground this a little bit further, legally, getting a recruitment right really helps protect against things like discrimination and potential challenge too. So for your church, it builds trust, credibility, and consistency, especially when decisions are visible to others. And biblically, this aligns really clearly with the principles we already see. So we're called to show impartiality, not to favor some over others. We're encouraged to choose leaders wisely based on their character and capability. And we're reminded to do things properly and in an orderly way too. So actually, good recruitment practice isn't separate from our values. It actually supports them. It helps you live them out in a really practical way. So here's what we're going to focus on today. First, advertising decisions. When should you advertise a role and when might it not be reasonable to? Second, the genuine occupational requirement, or GOR, as I'll refer to it today. What it is, when it applies, how to apply it correctly in a church context. Third, what good recruitment actually looks like. So a simple structured approach that you can apply without making things overly complex. And then finally, a practical checklist. So something you can take away, use straight away in your next recruitment process that you have. So by the end, the aim is that you feel more clearer, more confident, and better equipped to approach recruitment too. So before we go any further, really helpful to get a quick sense of the room, really. So the question I've got on screen, if you'd just like to put an answer in the chat, is how do you usually recruit roles in your church? So you can just respond using one of the answers on screen. So A, mostly informal, you tend to ask someone you know or they're already serving. B, a mix. Sometimes you advertise, sometimes you don't. It depends. C, mostly advertise. You put roles out openly before making a decision. Or D, it varies. There's no consistent approach. Each situation feels different. Let's just see what we've got. We've got a mix coming through. Thanks for your responses. Great. So that's what I'd expect to see, a real mix. Some churches lean more informal, some more structured, and many sit somewhere between that as well. So that's exactly why this session is useful because it helps bring clarity across all of these different approaches. So let's build on that a little bit. In the chat again, I'd love you to share what's one challenge you've faced when recruiting in your church. It could be something practical, something relational, something where you weren't quite sure what the right approach was. I'll just give you a moment to type one thing in the chat. I've given you some ideas there on screen, so it could be things like navigating relationships, process uncertainty, just not knowing what to do or where to start. But it could be different for everybody. Trying to pop a thought in the chat for this one. Yeah, so we've got not knowing what records we need to keep. Absolutely. Something we'll come on to and why it's important. How to recruit for high level and low levels roles in the best way. Again, yeah, just getting some clarity around the best way to do this, best practice. When you know all the candidates personally, so trying to not ensure bias, conflict arise. Yeah, I guess we're getting into that. How do you navigate relationship kind of thing too? So the whole mix again there. If you keep popping your thoughts into, we might come back to some of that later. So yeah, I can see small pool of skilled people, managing expectations when you only have a few applicants, or you might know them too. Great. And what's important to say here is you're not alone in this, and you can see that through the comments coming in the chat. The challenges you're describing are really common across churches, whether it's navigating relationships, uncertainty about progress, just not knowing where to start. So, what we'll do now is start to work through those kind of things together. So this is the reality for many churches, and it's important to say these approaches are often well intentioned. You might be thinking, we want someone who fits our church, we'd rather appoint someone we know or trust. Advertising can feel unnecessary at times or even a bit too formal. And again, none of that is wrong. Those decisions are usually rooted in care, trust, and wanting the best for the church. But this is where the tension starts to come in. A real common situation that we see is people have someone in mind. They've got someone who's serving faithfully. They've got someone they trust. They understand the culture of the church. And naturally, the question becomes, do we still need to run a process? Do we still need to advertise? And the honest answer is really that it depends. And what we're going to do next is give you the clarity to work through that thought process confidently. So let's come on to one of the most common questions. Do we need to advertise for every role? The short answer is no, not always. There's no blanket legal requirement to advertise every role, but, and this is the real key point, if you decide not to advertise, you need to be able to clearly justify that decision. So there are situations where not advertising can be reasonable. For example, where there is a clear and genuine internal progression route, where a role is temporary or time sensitive, or where the pool of candidates is genuinely very limited, and advertising would realistically broaden that pool. However, this is where caution is really important. If you already have someone in mind before you've really considered the role, and if you haven't genuinely considered alternatives, that's where caution needs to come in. Or, and this is the key test, if you could confidently explain your decision to someone outside your church, that's usually where risk starts to come in. So, what does a valid explanation really look like and sound like? It might be we followed a clear internal progression route, as you can see on screen. This was a short-term, time-sensitive role, or we assessed the external market and advertising wouldn't have added any meaningful value. But what doesn't count as a valid explanation is we already knew who we wanted, or they've been around a long time, or it just felt right. They're not valid reasons. So let's look at where informal recruitment can go wrong, and importantly, why that is. Because again, informal doesn't automatically mean wrong, but it does carry risk. If decisions are based on familiarity, choosing someone because you know them, and there's a risk of missing capability gaps as well. The person may be trusted, but the role actually might require skills or experience that they haven't you haven't fully explored. If there's a lack of transparency, so where decisions aren't clearly visible, people can struggle to understand how or why decisions were made. That can impact trust, particularly for those who weren't considered. Again, can come into some of the thoughts I've seen in the chat there, perhaps around bias as well, and some conflicts can arise in these situations. There's also a risk of unconscious bias. So we naturally gravitate towards people we know, people like us, or people we're comfortable with, but that can narrow the pool too and mean you miss out on people who could bring something different or even stronger. And finally, without a clear process or documentation, it becomes very difficult to evidence that a decision was fair if it's ever questioned. So you're exposed even if the decision was made in good faith. And a real common example we see in this is a church appoints someone they know and trust, and then a few months in, they realize there are gaps, and they weren't picked up during the process. So this is about avoiding those situations before they happen. But what happens if recruitment isn't done well? Just to bring a bit of clarity to this, what actually is the consequence, really? Churches can recruit informally for years and it can feel like it's working, but when issues do arise, it's usually triggered by a person, someone who feels they've been treated unfairly, someone who questions a decision, or someone who challenges a requirement, particularly around faith. And that's when things can move from an internal decision to a legal issue. So, under UK law, particularly the Equality Act 2010, if a requirement like faith is applied incorrectly, that can amount to unlawful discrimination, and that can then lead to a claim with potential financial and reputational impact. But there are also wider consequences, damage to trust within the church, people feeling excluded or treated unfairly, and that can be just as significant as the legal side too. So this isn't just about creating fear, it's about making sure your decisions are clear, fair, and something you can confidently stand behind. So this brings us to the genuine occupational requirement or GOR, and this is really important concept in a church context. A GOR allows you to require a specific characteristic, most commonly that someone is a Christian, but only where that requirement is essential to the role, and that's the key bit. That's what the essential word is the key point we're making here. Not preferred, not ideal. We're looking at essential. There are two key tests that need to be met. The first is that it must be justifiable, which means there must be a clear role-based reason why that requirement is necessary. It needs to come directly from what the role actually involves. Second is that it must be proportionate, which means it must be appropriate that and not applied more widely than necessary. So, for example, applying a faith requirement across every role in your church, including admin or technical roles, is very unlikely to be proportionate. And the final key point here is Agora apply the final key point really here is that Agora applies to the role, not the person. So it's not about who you would ideally like, it's about the role, what the role genuinely requires. But I want to pause here and acknowledge something that often sits underneath this whole conversation. For many churches, there's a genuine desire to have staff who are Christians, and that makes complete sense. Trust me, I'm a Christian and I truly get the thinking behind that. It comes from wanting alignment with your beliefs, protecting the culture of the church, and ensuring unity within the team. So, this isn't about dismissing that, it's about understanding how to apply it correctly. So, legally, you can only require someone to be a Christian when it's essential to the role, which is what we've talked about when it comes to the GOR. If that requirement is applied too broadly, for example, across roles where faith isn't central, it can amount to unlawful discrimination. And that can lead to real consequences. So, discrimination claims, legal challenge, and reputational impact for the church too. But beyond the legal side, there's also a practical impact. If you apply that requirement too widely, you may be missing out on skilled, capable people who could contribute significantly to the work of the church. People who align with the values in practice, even if they don't meet that specific requirement. So the aim here isn't to remove faith from recruitment decisions. It's about applying it thoughtfully, appropriately, and in a way that is both legally sound and aligned with the purpose of the role. So let's just look at some roles in practice, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. If we think about a church admin role, what would you say? Do you think this is a GOR could be applied here or not? Just put yes or no in the chat, if that's okay. Nice, we've got a mix coming through. So what we'd actually see is that GOR is actually unlikely to apply. Again, like you say, it would depend on the nature of the role. It's a really key point there. It would really depend on what the job description is talking about. We might see two church admin roles and they have actually completely different responsibilities. So it is all about the responsibilities, but typically we see that it wouldn't be applied here. What about a youth pastor? Do we think about that? Yeah. So it's more likely to apply here. It's got a pastoral and spiritual element to it. What about a finance manager? Yes or no? Yeah, so we're getting the idea here. So the role is technical, it's not spiritually led. And then what about a worship leader? Yeah. So it's likely to apply. Faith is intrinsic to leading worship. So these are the roles that are more likely to qualify. Things like pastor and minister, youth leader, worship leader, chaplain, children's worker with a pastoral focus. These are less likely to qualify. Again, it does depend, so there is nuance to this, but typically we're looking at church admin, finance manager, operations manager, IT support, facilities, premises staff. So it's not to say these people can't be Christians. It's just that the idea of the goal being applied is less likely to qualify. So why does it matter getting this right? We've talked about the key benefits really so far. Reduces legal and reputational risk. Having that documented key process, consistent process, sorry, protects your church if decisions are ever questioned. That's internally or externally. Builds trust and transparency. So when people see that roles have been filled fairly and confidently, you see confidence in church leadership grow. It helps find the best person. So like I say, you actually get at the skills that you need, capability required that you might not get through an informal means. And it also reflects integrity and stewardship. So how you recruit says something about your values. So doing it well is actually an act of faithfulness to God, to your community, and to the people you serve too. So let's just come on to a simple recruitment approach before we get into some of the how it could look like when you advertise. Good recruitment doesn't need to be complicated. This is the good news. There are four simple steps that provide a simple framework. So the first one we've got is role clarity, being really clear on what the role is, what it involves, and what you're looking for. A lot of recruitment issues actually start here when roles aren't clearly defined. The second is advertising, so thinking intentionally about whether and how you open the role up. The third is structured selection, so having a consistent way of assessing candidates rather than relying on instinct or informal conversations. And then fourthly, pre-employment checks, so making sure everything is in place before confirming the appointment. Each of these builds on the last, and if you get the first one right, role clarity, it makes everything else much easier. But I wanted to briefly touch on volunteers as well, because this is such a significant part of church life. If volunteer recruitment is often more informal, it usually happens through conversations, relationships, and word of mouth. And that's not necessarily wrong. It reflects how churches naturally operate. But even with volunteers, it's still important to bring some structure and clarity. For example, providing a clear role overview. What does the role involve? What are the expectations? What does good look like? Because often the issue isn't willingness, it's clarity. But now a key difference is that volunteers are not employees. So you can't require attendance or performance in the same way. You don't have the same level of control or obligation, which means your approach needs to be different, more focused on clarity, encouragement, and support rather than enforcement. But with that said, safer recruitment still applies where relevant, particularly for roles involving children or vulnerable groups. So things like DBS checks and references are still really important. So the balance here is keeping the relational nature of volunteering, but adding enough clarity so people understand what they're stepping into. And just to say, if supporting or motivating volunteers is something you're thinking about, that's definitely something we can support with at Cornerstone through training on how to manage volunteers and motivate them too. So at this point, I'm just going to hand over to Christian Jobs, so Joe at Christian Jobs, to share their perspective on elements of a good advert and where to advertise to.
Nice, thanks, Joe. You got some questions in the chat, Joe, as well. So if when I'm speaking, I don't know if you want to catch up
Great.
on those. Hi, everyone. My name is Joe. I work for Christian Jobs, which is a Christian job board and recruitment agency, UK based, and just to contribute to this conversation. So, the first thing I was going to look at is job advertising. So, if you've gone through the process that decide that you do want to advertise, there's obviously multiple levels of advertising from your own website to your job boards and all that kind of thing. But the elements of an advert remain pretty constant for advertising it, whether it's on social media, whether it's on a job board, whether it's word of mouth. The important things are still the important things to people. A report the back end of last year, I spoke to lots and lots of different Christians who are looking for job previous 2 years and asked them what the important things were when looking for a job. So you can see here, I have a bigger version of this. It's a report that I can send out later, but this is the essential things that most likely things that people are looking at when applying for a job. People will look at his salary. Naturally, it's going to be important. Whenever you go on a job board, it's normally the first thing that appears on the role. It's decreased slightly. We ran this report 2 years ago, and salary was first by an even further distance. It's come down slightly, but still, your salary and whole remuneration package needs to be clear on your advert. And working arrangements, statement of faith, and next steps are the really key things. If your job advert has each of those communicated, then chances are that whoever is applying for your job is going to know exactly what they're going in for. One of the interesting things on the company culture are actually very high on what people are looking for. Now, it's hard to get that across in an advert. Organizations will put one line in an advert that says something like, we're really collaborative, we like working as a team, we're that kind of thing. And I think it's got to a point where every advert now says something similar to that. So you have to differentiate pictures of the church, of prayer meetings, of services that are going on. And if you can get testimonials at the church, you may have seen organizations starting with like a couple of lines from the vicar or the pastor or the church leader at church, which can just really make it a bit more real than just a line in a job description about culture and organization, that kind of thing. Including elements on culture and statement of faith and values in job adverts is really important. Next slide, Joe.
Yeah.
So then once you've got your advert, it's good, it's ready to go to the next stage and apply, then to decide where to advertise. So naturally, churches need to be good stewards of their finance. So that doesn't necessarily mean advertising everywhere all at once because it'll be very costly and won't necessarily be free or very low cost options for advertising using church websites. Most will have a advertising space, whether that's a job board or something a bit more informal. There's often groups or things. The diocese similarly, and word of mouth. So obviously, even if you decide, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stop telling people about your roles. We always say to people, Christian Jobs works with Christian charities and church, a Christian organization, and you've got 10 employees, then chances are that those 10 employees each go to a church. It's church. And if they tell everyone they know who's a Christian about the role, then it's not long until you're reaching actually many, many people. Christians tend to be well connected, which is a really good, accessible way of advertising a role. Though these naturally will get a bigger response, especially if your role doesn't hold an occupational requirement. The general this isn't necessarily as good from a secular job board as you would expect from either a Christian specific job board or no, who already connected with the church or have an understanding of the theological base of the church and that kind of thing. Christian specific job boards, I'll be honest, they're all doing a pretty similar thing. Global Connections, Oscar, Eden. There are others as well that are more closely aligned to particular ecumenical ones. They all cost roughly the same. I think Oscar actually might be free for churches, but they all cost roughly £100 to advertise for 30 days, and applications can come directly through to the churches. That, um, it means that it's no longer a kind of localized advertising campaign. Relocation may be possible And it just means that your role is getting in front of more people than just your natural networks that you've been exposed.
Great, thanks, Joe. So, moving into advertising in a bit more detail, when you're advertising a role, there are a few key things that make a real big difference to add to what Joe's already said. So, being clear on the purpose of the role, not just listing tasks, using language that is inclusive and accessible, so you're not unintentionally narrowing your pool. Being clear about expectations, including whether it's a genuine occupational requirement applies and why, and importantly, reaching beyond just your immediate networks, as Joe started to touch on there. So, because one of the biggest benefits of advertising is that it opens up opportunities to people you might not already know. So once you've got candidates coming through, how do you actually assess them and what becomes really important? First of all, assessing against clear criteria. So you're measuring candidates against what the role actually requires rather than comparing people to each other or relying on general impressions. Second, asking consistent questions. So each candidate is given the same opportunity to demonstrate their experience and capability. And third, involving more than one person in the decision. This helps reduce bias, brings different perspectives, and adds accountability too. And the real shift here is from this is that is they feel like a good fit to this. They meet the criteria for the role because that makes your decisions much more consistent, fair, and defensible when you apply that level, that thinking into it. So rather than it feels right, you're thinking they meet the criteria. So I realise we're coming towards 1 o'clock. I'm going to continue with the session just so that we do give you the information that you need. If you need to drop off, that's okay. I will send the recording round, but if you're able to stay again, that's great. So you can see the session through. But I will follow up afterwards with the recording too. So let's look at a safer recruitment. These are the essentials. And it's really important to say these are not optional extras. They're a baseline expectation for responsible recruitment. Firstly, right to work checks. You need to verify that every person you employ has the legal right to work in the UK. This is a legal requirement, and failing to do this can result in significant penalties. Secondly, references. So you should obtain at least 2 references before confirming any appointment. Ideally, these are professional references where possible. And if anything in those references is unclear, it's important to follow up rather than just accepting it. And third, DBS checks where relevant. So if a role involves working with children or vulnerable adults, a DBS check is required. And it's important to assess the appropriate level depending on the role too. And just to emphasize this point, because it's a real common gap, even if you know the person, even if they've been in your church for years, even if they're trusted, these checks still apply. Having that familiarity isn't a substitute for what we call due diligence, and actually completing these checks protects both the individual and the church too. So where do most things commonly slip? And again, this is usually not through negligence, it's through a habit or pressure. One is skipping checks, assuming that because you know someone, you don't need to complete the usual steps. But as we've said, that's where risk can come in. Another is rushing decisions. So sometimes there's urgency, you need someone in place quickly, but often that leads to shortcuts. Shortcuts can create long-term issues. Third, no documentation. So if the decisions aren't written down, how you assess candidates, why you made a decision, it becomes very difficult to explain or defend later. And finally, blurred processes. In a church context, pastoral relationships and employment decisions can overlap, and that's quite natural, but it's important to keep some separation so decisions remain clear and fair. So being aware of these areas is a big step in helping yourself avoid them. And so just to bring this all together as we come towards a close, here's a simple checklist you can use. And like I say, I'll send this round afterwards so you can think when I've got a role, let's go through these things. Have we clearly defined the role? Have we considered whether to advertise? Can we explain that decision? If we've applied a requirement like faith, have we clearly justified it? Have we followed a fair and consistent process? Have we completed all the necessary checks? This doesn't need to be complicated, but having this as a simple framework helps you stay consistent as well. So coming on to the key takeaways. So really the 5 things I'd hope you'd take from this last half an hour is this. So first, be clear on what, when and why you advertise roles. Not every role needs to be advertised, but you should always be able to explain the decision. I know I've repeated that, but it's so important. Ensure decisions are fair, transparent, and justifiable. Only apply Gore where it's essential to the role. Keep recruitment simple, structured, consistent, and don't skip over those safer recruitment checks as well, even if you know the person. And just before we finish, I just want to give you a moment to reflect. So, whether you've been able to stay on the call or you've had to jump off, I'd just like you to think about this when you do watch the recording back as well. Is what is one thing you're going to do differently the next time you recruit in your church? If you could just take a moment to think, and then if you're still on the call, if you want to share your thought in the chat, if you feel comfortable, that'd be great. But like I say, if you're watching this back, I do encourage you still to think about this and perhaps write it down because writing something down does help you commit to it in the future. It could be something like a proper role description involving another decision maker or just pausing. Could we explain this decision publicly? 'Cause just having that pause can sometimes help as well. So I'll let you put some thoughts in the chat while I just go through these last couple of slides. How can we support just beyond this? Because I know we've delivered a session today, but we don't want to say go ahead and just do it, run off with all this stuff and do this yourself. If you do want further support, at Cornerstone, we can support you with further HR queries. I will come back to you on some of these questions in the chat as I can see. But if you need help with recruitment, you want to ask us and sort of sense check some thoughts, because I know we've talked about the genuine occupational requirement and there can be some nuance around that. So if you want to check with us on that, please do. Do check with your consultant if you're one of our clients. Like Joe said, Christian Jobs can also support you too with advertising your next role, or if you just want to explore options too. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. Do stay in touch with us if you'd like to. We will be running more of these sessions throughout the rest of the year. A mix of sessions that'll help you sort of prepare for the law changes coming in, but also just to help you run effectively as a church and follow best practice and be as effective as you can be. So I've got a mix of sessions. They're all available on our training events website on the cornerstoneresources.co.uk website. And if you do have time, I'd always appreciate feedback, as I'm sure Joe would, as to what you found good about this session, what you'd like to improve, if you think there was something else we could do in this session too. I will just put a link in the chat if you do have time to go to this. So you've got that in there. I can see one comment coming through around what someone's going to do after this session. So making sure if you recruit without advertising, you can justify it publicly. And I think that, to be honest, is the key takeaway from this. So I love that that's in there. Two, can see think carefully about whether we need to advertise and whether we need a go. You get plans to add more clarifying questions in an application form too. So I can see there's some questions in there from previous earlier in the session. I'll come back to you on those ones just with a bit more of a thoughtful response because they do need a bit more to them than just a yes or no. So thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your time today. And like I say, I'll send the recording round, follow up afterwards. But yeah, I hope you have a good rest of the day and a good weekend too. Cheers, everyone.